been dubbed as Brazil's answer to Donald Trump, and he came awfully close to scoring a first-round knockout. The far-right's Jair Bolsonaro garnering 46% in Sunday's presidential race. Bolsonaro, a former military officer, who's prone to waxing lyrical about the days of the dictatorship and to tirades against women, sexual minorities, and Afro-Brazilians, on crime for more guns, on the economy, slash taxes, and chip away at the welfare state. Bolsonaro has clearly taken votes from all the other parties, including the left-wing PT, the Workers' Party of runoff opponent Fernando Haddad. Can the hand-picked stand-in for jailed former president Lula Inácio da Silva make up a 16-point deficit? Beyond the corruption scandals that have tainted the entire political class, why has the PT, which ruled Brazil for 13 of the past 15 years, fallen out of favor? What does the seismic shift we're witnessing mean for the region? And more broadly, what does the appeal of a politically incorrect, self-styled strongman say about leadership in Brazil and far beyond? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Brazil's far-right swing, and joining us here in the studio from Sao Paulo, he's a journalist and columnist, William Walk. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
From London, the co-author of Brazil, Neoliberalism versus Democracy, Alfredo Saad Filho, who teaches political economy at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks, ma'am.
From sister station Radio France International, Maria Pauro Carvalho, journalist at RFI and the author of How to Rebuild Brazil?
Yes.
Published earlier this year in Portuguese. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Now, last week, there was a dour man in the newsroom who predicted that Bolsonaro would win outright or come very close. Nobody believed him, so we had to invite him on. France24.com's David Gormezano, formerly correspondent in Sao Paulo.
Good evening. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. October 28th, the date for that second round runoff. Jair Bolsonaro claiming on social media he would have won outright on Sunday, but there was fraud, he says. No sign of that, insists the Electoral Court. The 63-year-old former congressman now hopes to seal an astonishing rise. Peter O'Brien has more.
From the fringes of politics to being a few points away from running the country. During his 27 years in Brazil's Congress, Jair Bolsonaro was known for little more than his extreme comments which have even landed him fines.
My sons would never fall in love with a black woman. They were raised well. A few days ago, you called me a rapist. I told you I wouldn't rape you because you don't deserve it. If one of us, civilian or soldier, is assaulted, if he shoots the attacker 20 times, it serves them right. He must be decorated, not judged.
In a crowded presidential race, Brazil's frontrunner was slow to get his campaign off the ground. He didn't have a pick for vice president until August, when he named a retired general. A former army captain himself, Bolsonaro has spoken nostalgically about Brazil's former military dictatorship, which used torture systematically. His campaign has been run on a fraction of the cost of those of some other candidates, relying heavily on social media.
It's the media that portrays him as a racist and a sexist, but he's none of those things. It's a conspiracy theory against him, designed to bring down the only honest candidate.
Bolsonaro has been unaffected by the corruption scandal that's angered so many voters and tainted the Workers' Party, Brazil's former ruling power. This, combined with a collection of stances drawing supporters from different angles, has slowly caused a sea change in Brazilian politics. Bolsonaro continually rails against communism, winning over those worrying about what more left-wing policies could do to the country. For the influential evangelical lobby, he's a voice against abortion and gay marriage. He's also backed by the powerful farming lobby, who welcome his plans to ease gun control as a way to protect plantations. He wants to privatize extensively and cut tax, gaining the support of wealthy and conservative voters.
It's been a rough and tumble campaign, Maria Paro Carvalho, and it's not over yet. You've Lula, who was barred from running from jail, Bolsonaro, who was stabbed on the campaign trail, doing a lot of his campaigning from his hospital bed the last couple of weeks. Now it's day one of the runoff campaign, and Brazil's stock market has surged 6% at the opening bell, a little bit lower later in the day, but still, investors are cheering. Why?
Well, I think Brazil is more divided than ever, and the results of yesterday's elections reflects that. Some of the voters, they are reliable to the Workers' Party for all the efforts it has done to fight corruption, to fight poverty and inequality, and the other half of Brazilians claim it is responsible for the economic problems, and also for the corruption scandals uncovered on the past years. I think you should put things into perspective to understand what is going on in Brazil. Remember that a few years ago, we became the B of the BRICS. We were supposed to be one of the biggest economies in the world. We managed to control inflation, poverty, inequality, and no other country before us had the chance to host the World Cup and the Olympics back to back. But the contrast over 2 decades is striking. Brazil has a recession in 2015 and 2016, just compared to the 1929 Great Depression. The unemployment rate grew. We have 13 million people out of jobs in Brazil today.
So
and despite achievements in poverty, inequality remains in highly levels in Brazil. So I would say that the vote for Bolsonaro is much due to a vote of protest against all the situation that I've just described.
Do you agree with that, William Walk?
I think we are in a cultural war. Of course, when you have a recession like that provoked by irresponsible fiscal policies from a typical populist leftist party, it doesn't matter whether you have a rightist or a leftist populist. They all do the same thing. They run down public finances, and they are distributing money they don't have. That's no difference whatsoever between rightists and leftist populists. They wreak havoc everywhere where they are in power, and that was the case in Brazil. But we are in the middle of a cultural war, no doubt about that.
A cultural war, explain.
Bolsonaro's a cultural war, yes, in terms of values. What explains Bolsonaro's success so far is not so much how bad Brazilians feel about the economical situation, which is in dire straits, no doubt about that, but it's the fact that they are tired of what they call establishment politicians, and these are the leftists as well. When I say this is a cultural war, I'm using more the German expression for that, in terms of that widespread sense that people are lying to the people. Widespread sense that some of the core values of established society are being lied upon by the media, which was devastated by this rightist tsunami. It's more than sea change, it's a tsunami, driving the country towards that. We saw it in Central Eastern Europe. We saw it by Brexit, and probably we saw it in terms in France and the United States as well. It's a sort of reaction which is atavic, which is much more subjective and by intuition than anything else.
All right, so part of a global phenomenon. Let's look at the results for a second, David Gormazano. If you break down the voting by region, only the north and the northeast of Brazil resists this Bolsonaro wave that we saw on Sunday. There we've got the map coming up, where we can show you here, and the parts that are in green or in red, excuse me, are the ones for the PT, and the rest of the country going for Bolsonaro.
The PT used to be strong in the south, in the industrialized south, but has vanished. And leading figures of the PT, like Dilma Rousseff in Minas Gerais, or Eduardo Suplicy in São Paulo have been wiped out of the race. They reached third or fourth position.
And do you agree with William Wack that we're dealing with is a global phenomenon? People rejecting the political class, rejecting incumbents, rejecting...
I mean, yes, the Michel Temer's party, which is now called the MDB...
The outgoing president.
Exactly. He was, has been the kingmaker in Brazilian politics for decades. And now the MDB is a medium, small political party. Same thing with the PSDB, who has been in the runoff for the presidential election 6 times in a row. And this time, Gerardo Alckmin did a 5%. So there is a rejection.
So there's sea change going on, rejection of the established class, and yet the stock market is cheering. Why?
Well, the stock market was looking for a candidate, and until last week, they realized that none of the candidates that they could have liked, like Enrique Meireles, the former president of the central bank, or Gerardo Alckmin, who is a business-friendly politician, would do well in the election. So the business sector doesn't want at all costs the PT to win a fifth election in a row. And they decided to back Bolsonaro. That was last week, I think.
Decided to back Bolsonaro. What's going to happen now, though, in terms of he's standing by his cut taxes economic policy.
Well, you saw that video that we saw last night, Bolsonaro's speech after the announcement of the first results. Sitting on his right-hand side is Paulo Guedes, who is his chief economist, and Paulo Guedes is well known. Paulo Guedes is someone who was influenced by the theories of the Chicago School and advocates a much thinner state and liberal economies.
The exact opposite of what the Workers' Party advocated in its time in power. This, let the free market help to bring growth to everybody, is the exact opposite of what we've seen. And yet so many people who used to vote for the Workers' Party this time around voted for Bolsonaro. Why is that?
Yes, because they really want to change. They want a kind of security or a more stabilized country, even though if it was based in a very basic program. But in fact, what is important for the future, tried and true economic policies would say that growth in Brazil should be based on investments and gains of productivity. But what happens in Brazil is that investment rate is just 14%, much lower than the other BRICS countries. And so Brazil also cannot hope to generate growth just with foreign investments. So Brazilian people need to understand that they need to have domestic savings and also a balanced state budget. Brazil also could benefit from more integration to another trade agreements. Today we can say we are quite an isolated country. The gross domestic product is expected to grow 1.8% this year.
Right.
So Brazilians want to change the economy. And as William Wack said, people are really tired of corruption. So you have this Lava Jato scandal. So just to have an idea about the numbers, it's $2 billion that were picked up from Petrobras, diverted for politicals. So the authorities discovered in Brazil that corruption has deeply permeated state-owned companies such as the giant oil Petrobras with the help of politicians and the bureaucracy in Brazil.
Alfredo Sad Filho, when we discussed Lava Jato, when it was breaking wide open, when the scandals both at Petrobras and at construction giant Odebrecht were coming to light, there were those saying this is great news because it shows Brazil is maturing and that we're able to confront corruption and tackle these problems. Now, the day after the first round of the presidential election, what are your thoughts?
The Lava Jato operation has been extremely destructive for the Brazilian economy. It has opened up the existence of corruption, but this was never a secret. The Brazilian political system for 500 years has operated on the basis of corrupt agreements. What the operation, this most recent operation, has discovered is how to use corruption scandals in order to hound from office a political party that was considered to be undesirable. And I have heard in this program some really unhelpful, inflammatory rhetoric, attempting to characterize previous administrations as populist, when in fact they were popular. You're not using the term in the correct sense. They were popular, and this is what was provocative for people who are used to exercising unchallenged power in the country. Now,
so why did people turn away from the PT?
The political right in Brazil. The political right in Brazil has won elections only on the basis of corruption scandals. In 1961 with Jânio Quadros, in 1989 with Fernando Collor, and this time around. In addition, the government of Dilma Rousseff elected was overthrown because of corruption scandals. Now, corruption is a problem in a country like Brazil. It is also a problem in other countries in the world. But the systematic use of investigations in order to subvert a democratic administration, that is more problematic than anything else. The fact that $2 billion were taken from Petrobras is a criminal scandal. But much more than that has been destroyed in the oil chain, in the naval industry, and in the construction industry. So how many jobs have been lost because of the use of corruption for political ends? It goes into the millions. Now, we are at risk of losing sight of the goal, which is a political system that is honest and functional, as opposed to a dysfunctional one, in order to maintain power concentrated in the old political parties. Now, when you destroy the political system in the way that has taken place in Brazil, this is what you get. You get somebody who is a fascist poised to seize power in the country. That must count as a known goal from the point of view of the media, from the point of view of the judicial system, and from the point of view of the political forces that took Dilma Rousseff away from power in order to keep power for themselves. They failed.
We're going to pick up. We're going to pick up. We're going to pick up on these points
in the election.
We have to take a quick break. We're going to pick up on these points and look at what direction Brazil is headed in now. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
We are electing an honest man. We're trying to free ourselves from the corruption which assassinates millions and millions of Brazilians by making them jobless, by making them ignorant, and by leaving them without proper health care.
It's a difficult day for Brazil, a day of sadness. It's also a day of shame and struggle, lots of struggle. Today we begin the fight for the second round. That man will not win.
Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're digesting the results out of Brazil, where a far-right candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, is on 46% ahead of a second round slated for October the 28th. With us to talk about it, joining us from Sao Paulo, journalist and columnist William Walk. I want to welcome back as well from London, Alfredo Saad Filho, who teaches at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. Here in the studio, Maria Paula Carvalho, journalist at the Brazilian service of sister station Radio France International, the author of Brazil, A Rebuilding? How to Rebuild? How would you translate it properly? A Reconstruction, okay, out earlier this year in Portuguese. And France24.com's David Gormezano, who is our former correspondent in Sao Paulo. Just before the break, we heard Alfredo Saad Filho wonder aloud if we're any closer to a functioning political system after the corruption that scandals and the probes that have come out the last couple of years that have washed away the political establishment in Brazil, both in the lower chamber, where we saw the party of Bolsonaro make spectacular inroads, climbing from, let me just look this up exactly, climbing from something like 8 seats here we are, 8 seats, that's right, to 52 to become the second largest formation. In the Senate, it's still the centrists who control the lion's share of seats, but they're splintered into a multitude of parties. We can show you perhaps, no, that's the wrong grab. We'll play that later on for you. There we are, the Senate where it's 47, and there you see the PT has lost 4 seats, more conservative body, David Gormazano, and so therefore it's right now it's all about coalition building. 16-point deficit for Fernando Haddad of the Workers' Party. Mission impossible?
My opinion is that it is mission impossible. I can't imagine the Workers' Party winning a 5th election in a row after this acute political crisis that Brazil has went through in the last 3-4 years with the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff and who practically couldn't govern from day one because she didn't have a majority in the lower house. And eventually it is this lower house that voted her impeachment. And today it seems that Bolsonaro is capable of building a coalition that will support his policies. From what I gather from the results of the legislative part of this election, it is likely that a number of very small parties. There is about 28 parties in the lower house in Brazil, in this who do not have a very ideological position. They are rural. They are elected in rural areas, and interests and lobbies are very strong.
So you can cobble together a coalition, is what you're saying?
Yes, definitely.
Brazil's former president Lula tweeting from prison in the second round. Let's pull together, he says, for a Brazil of dialogue and respect. Hope will conquer hate. Come and volunteer. With Lula out, again, it's Fernando Haddad jumping to the top of the ticket, reaching out, and there you see the tweet there from Lula, reaching out to possible coalition partners. Fernando Haddad calling for a debate.
We'll be going into this debate with respect. In these elections, we have only one weapon, and that is our policies. We don't carry guns.
Yeah, he's talking about weapons because of Bolsonaro's calls for more guns and more police powers for fighting crime. William Walk, tell us, because Bolsonaro, who'd been sidelined by that assassination attempt, are we going to see a candidates debate before the second round?
Oh, yeah, sure, we'll see. And that would be a more or less easy task for Bolsonaro. Haddad just gave him what he needed today. The first thing Haddad did after the first round of voting was to visit his master at the jail. So this couldn't be a better gift for Bolsonaro to establish his party line, which is, if Haddad is elected, Lula will be freed. And this is, in political terms, a very much a bombshell in Brazil. Just shows that Haddad has no own personality. He's just following what his master says behind the bars. But what I think that we are missing, particularly for our foreign audience, is that the main battle line in Brazil is not so much between liberal or, let's say, more leftist economic policies, recommendations, but more or less how to reestablish a minimum of investment capacity from the state itself. What PT did after more than 30 years appropriation of public funds by private entities. The private entities are political parties, right? Brazilian political parties were appropriating themselves of public goods for the best part of the last 30 years. And PT accelerated that process and broke the state bank, so to say. So Bolsonaro has, or Haddad for that sense, both of them has a very, 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 very difficult challenge, which is to tell everyone we will have losers everywhere if we just want to repair the fiscal deficit. If you want to reestablish a minimum of investment capacity from the state sector, we have to impose a lot of suffering everywhere. I don't think any one of them are capable to do that right now.
Alfredo Saad-Filho, you agree?
No, not at all. As it is as if corruption had been invented by the PT, and if it had been a new thing in Brazil. Now, Fernando Collor was elected in 1989. The PT had not been in government. Jânio Quadros in 1961, there was no PT. The campaign against Getúlio Vargas in the 1950s was about corruption. Corruption is the way in which a liberal platform gets mass traction in Brazil, is by using the slogan of corruption. Remember, the coup of 1964 was justified because of the corruption of the political system. No, corruption is common across Brazilian history, but it is weaponized from time to time by the political right, and this is happening again.
But
now,
the point that William Wack was making there, Alfredo, is simply that whoever governs Brazil isn't telling the truth on the campaign trail, that there's going to have to be a lot of suffering ahead if you want to put the economy back on the rails.
This is the discourse of the coup in 2016. There had to be strong measures for adjustment. 2 years later, what has happened in terms of the economy? The measures were introduced, they were voted by Congress, they were implemented, no reaction on the economy. It is not the liberalization of the Brazilian economy that will do the trick. It is something else to do with the way Brazil has inserted itself into the world economy underneath China as a supplier of primary commodities. It is with the lack of industrial policy. It is with the lack of an employment policy. This is what is missing. It's not more liberalization. It's not selling Brazilian companies, more Brazilian companies, to foreign capital. This has been tried, and it does not work.
Lots of reactions on the hashtag. Go ahead, very briefly, William Wack.
This point? Yes, when we are talking who invented corruption, I always remember who invented sex. I mean, it's a useless question. The point is, PT was dedicating itself to corruption happily, as everybody dedicate ourselves to sex, and we don't ask who has invented it. I mean, the result is what counts, and the result, the disaster in which we find ourselves now, is so widespread, is so deep, that we really have to consider the possibility that Brazil will never, never get out of the middle-income trap. We are in the middle-income trap due to lack of productivity, due of lack of competition, and due to, in part, just in part, to PT's policies in terms of trade agreements and Brazil international insertion. So the challenge is much, much broader than asking who has invented sex.
On the hashtag F24 debate, lots of reactions, including this one from Jane. Corruption and crime are shaping the outcome of the presidential election. Bolsonaro running on a platform that promises transparency and a strong crackdown on crime. The media is not reporting the extreme circumstances leading the voters to favor Bolsonaro. Of course, it could be seen both ways. I've heard accusations saying, Maria Paula Carvalho, that the media in Brazil is skewed against the PT and that it's too much, and that has opened the door for Bolsonaro.
What we see in Brazil with regards to media is that after a long period of silence due to the authoritarian regime, the journalists have recovered their role of watchdogs. So I think more than any other forces, journalism has unveiled these corruption cases in Brazil. And I have to say that it's not a question of disqualifying the social policies made by the former president Lula. For example, the World Bank has a very good evaluation about the family, Bolsa Familia, as we say, which is a transfer, cash transfer money policy, but it's a question of who is going to implement the social policies. We have to say that the stars of the former part of the PT, as the former president Dilma Rousseff was not re-elected. So people want to change the team that is implemented social policies in Brazil. Of course, we need social policies in a country that has a huge amount of poor people.
Another reaction, and David, I'll read it to you. From the outside looking in, it looks like a new military dictatorship is beginning. That's another reaction on the hashtag F24 debate. What will a Bolsonaro presidency look like?
Well, he's a former army captain. His vice president, the candidate for vice president, is an ex-general. And it is true that in the last year in Brazil, we've heard the military again. The military has taken a stand in some episodes of the political life. The latest one I can think of is when the Supreme Court had to rule over Lula going to prison or not. The chief of staff expressed itself, saying that for the sake of democracy, it would be better for Lula to go to jail. It was a long time in Brazil that militaries were not speaking aloud as they have been in the
since the return to democracy in 1985.
Exactly. And same thing, Michel Temer, the acting president, has given to the army the task of assuring law and order in Rio de Janeiro. I mean, it's been noticed, but I mean the effect is terrible. You're giving the army much more. The actual government has given the army much more power than they ever had since 1985. So it's difficult to predict how Jair Bolsonaro will rule Brazil if he's elected. But he's in many of his declarations, he's been in favor of more power to the army and the armed forces and the military police, and we'll see about this.
William Wack?
Yes, there is just one misspelling probably from our colleague who was just spoke. It wasn't the chief of staff who said that. It was the commander of the army himself. It's higher than that chief of staff. What actually happened, the chief of staff was sent, and he started on September 13th as a special advisor to the president of the Supreme Court. So that's the first time in Brazil that we have the president of the Supreme Court, who is the president of the judiciary system, aided by a former chief of the staff of the army. What does it tell us and tells whoever is following this program? Tells that the military in Brazil are afraid. That, I think, is the best description of their state of mind right now. They think that the country is sliding toward a possible social chaos, which was very near during the truckers' strike back in April. And the military in Brazil, I'm talking about the generals, they are afraid that they cannot control a situation which could be sliding down toward social chaos. So their interventions are if you want to put that way, I would agree. They are worried very much that they will be called to do something that they don't want to do, which is to intervene. This is a very paradoxical situation. In which we have to see it in the nuances of policy and not put it in the bad or good scheme.
Alfredo Sadfield, you agree?
The Brazilian political system has been dismantled deliberately in order to achieve the outcome we have now. The biggest political leader in Brazilian history, Lula, is in jail. The government of Dilma Rousseff was deposed, and the political groupings that have hijacked the state have been able to achieve precisely nothing. Now, at the moment then, and it's entirely on their responsibility. There is a political vacuum, and the military have been called in to occupy this vacuum. This is an extremely dangerous, very delicate situation. Have been called in by the judiciary and by the media to occupy this space. And Bolsonaro thrives on this space as well, that the politicians are all corrupt, they are all incompetent, and therefore the military are the solution. Now, every thinking person knows that this is untrue. The functioning of the state requires politics, and what is going to happen, likely under a Bolsonaro administration, is the dragging of the army or the dragging of the armed forces into politics, into corruption scandals, and the transformation of the army into another gang. Look into Mexico as an example of what may happen in Brazil, except the Brazilian army has more tradition of interfering into politics than in Mexico. I think there is a constitutional impasse in Brazil with a likelihood of a meltdown of the political system and possibly a military administration in the not too distant future.
Maria Paula Carvalho, do you share that fear?
I do understand that the critics of Mr. Bolsonaro have watched his rise with fear that he would become an authoritarian leader. He has spoken with admiration to the dictatorship, we know that. And what happens in Brazil is that half of the population believe he may change things, and the other half think there is a plot against PT, against President Lula, that he should be running for president. But it's important to say, as William Vaca already said, that corruption in Brazil is spread around all political parties.
But could the military step into the vacuum is the question.
Of
the political vacuum right now. Could the military take on an even greater role?
I don't think we have a vacuum. As we see, Bolsonaro's Social Liberty Party is now the second largest in the Chamber of Deputies. You said it jumped from 8 to 51, and it's the second only to the Workers' Party, which has 57.
It's 10% of the lower chamber.
And also everybody says that Bolsonaro is sexist, he's racist. Of course, he has said very aggressive things against women, against the indigenous people, against black. But we have to remember that Brazil has very progressive laws against social discrimination in Brazil. We have the same-sex marriage for a long time. So I don't think these laws are going to be dismantled.
We're not going to go back to the days of the coup. You're saying back on August the 4th, Bolsonaro's son, himself a congressman, tweeted an image from New York City. He met with Donald Trump's former advisor, Steve Bannon, the same who has also advised the likes of Matteo Salvini here in Europe and Marine Le Pen, or actually the National Front. He was present at their conference. And there he is saying, "It's a pleasure to meet Steve Bannon. And we had a great conversation." Your thoughts when you look at that image, William Walk, these Brazilian elections, how much do we extrapolate? Is it part of a global battle that's unfolding?
No, I think there is a sex appeal from what happened in the American elections to Brazil, but that's very superficial. Bolsonaro is not a Brazilian Trump in that sense, and some of Bolsonaro's supporters are, of course, saying a lot of bad things about the Brazilian media and comparing Brazilian media to what happened in the American elections and so on. This is misleading as well. So Trump is moving against Brazil in the trade war that he has just started. And then I would like to see what Bolsonaro's support, who are applauding Trump right now, will have to say about that. But in terms of Steve Bannon, that's interesting, the comparison you brought up, because when I was referring to a cultural war, I had Steve Bannon in my mind. Steve Bannon was a happy participant in the American cultural war, and he was establishing patterns of behavior in social media in that cultural war that Bolsonaro's fans are trying to establish the same in Brazil. More or less in this way of thinking, what happened in the United States could happen as well here.
And And it's day one of the runoff campaign. We're running short on time. William Walk, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Sao Paulo. I want to thank Alfredo Saad Filo for being with us from London, Maria Paul Carvalho, and David Gormezano. Stay with us because Media Watch is next.